All right, welcome everyone. Today we have Nicola from New Zealand who's going to be discussing the impacts of New Zealand's immigration program as a result of the coronavirus. So we're going to be going through a lot of information. Today is May 5th and there's some breaking news coming out of New Zealand regarding changes to the immigration program which could come into effect within the next 10 days. We're also going to touch on temporary work permits, permanent residency, and top tips that immigration, HR and mobility professionals really should be paying attention to during this period of time in New Zealand. So I'm going to pass it over to Nicola to introduce herself, and then we're going to go into talking about what's actually happening in New Zealand right now. So Nicola, over to you.
Oh, lovely. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you all. I'm Nicola Tiffin. I work in one of New Zealand's largest law firms, Anthony Harper. We have offices in both Auckland and Christchurch, so both islands of New Zealand. I've specialised in immigration law for almost 20 years now. And yeah, it's changing quite rapidly at the moment, obviously in response to the COVID-19. So I'll try and run through the basics as quickly and as efficiently as I can for you today. But it will change, so feel free to keep in contact with me or Avinda if you've got any more questions.
Fantastic. So let's jump into that. New Zealand has kind of taken the world by storm and is almost a leader in the coronavirus pandemic. Hopefully the reports are correct in that they have almost eliminated the coronavirus. How's everything in New Zealand? Are you still in the lockdown phase? And if so, when do you expect that will be eased? And how are people feeling in New Zealand as a whole?
Oh, okay. Well, we had a pretty strict lockdown for 4 weeks, and we're moving progressively out of the strict lockdown phases, so moving through alert levels, hopefully back to normal life. So we had 4 weeks at alert level 4 where unless you're an essential worker, you couldn't leave your home except for once a day to go exercising, and you could only do that in your neighbourhood. You couldn't order food or anything to be delivered to you except for the essentials of life, which was groceries, a blanket or a jumper effectively, because we're going into winter. And now that we're at alert level 3, which we've been 1 week into alert level 3, and hopefully we've got this week now, and hopefully we're moving up to another level next week, but we can go out and buy coffee and take away food. You can go into the office to photocopy things or print things out. Building and construction is back at work, but they have to have at least 2 meters between them.
Okay.
And you can move house again. So some of the legal everyday things that are starting to happen again. Once we go to alert level 2, fingers crossed next week, we will be back to more normal life, but we're expecting that still public gatherings of probably less than 100 will be okay, but more than that will not. It'll still be at work, they'll still want 2 meter distancing, I would say. For example, under alert level 4, we had no elective surgeries, no operations at all, and so we're moving. There's a big backlog to get everybody. We're worried about people not having their scans or their operations, so there's going to be a lot of that happening, and a lot more building. And our tourism industry has been pretty much decimated. So we're hoping that we can go, as we move to alert level 2, we'll be able to set up a trans-Tasman bubble with our friends in Australia.
Yeah.
So we're hoping that we'll be able to travel backwards and forwards to Australia. And then, as I believe that the plan is that as we move through a level 2 and other countries get to the same level of control with the virus, that we'll be able to open individual exchanges between the countries to allow visitors to come in and for New Zealanders to travel out. That's the plan.
Okay, very interesting. So a lot of changes, and it looks like New Zealand really is on the breaking edge of developing a lot of these ideas and concepts for the rest of the world as well. Let's jump straight into the breaking news. You'd mentioned today that an announcement has been released to introduce a new act that would impact immigration. So let's jump into that. And today is May 5th as well, just in case anybody's watching. So I think that's
yes. So what's happened? Most of New Zealand immigration law is governed by one single act, And there was already backlogs with applications before all of this happened. And what happened when we went to alert level 4 is all the immigration officers went home, and none of them have worked really. A few of them have, but not many. And I believe that's because of technology and security and things like that. So the backlog has gotten considerably worse. What we have is approximately 350,000 temporary visa holders in New Zealand. And we've got about 60,000, 56,000 outside the country as well who are travelling and things like that. So at the moment, once we get back up to running, the minister is very concerned that he's not going to be able to, his team, his department are not going to be able to adequately and quickly process all the applications. So today he put in front of Parliament an immigration amendment COVID-19 response bill. And that's to amend that single piece of legislation we've got. Now, what he's proposing to do is to give himself powers to give whole classes of visa applicants or individuals visas, to amend whole classes of visa conditions, and to do things, for example, like automatically give people visas when they haven't applied for one. For example, if you couldn't because you're ill, and to extend first entry dates, to allow people to get their permanent residence visas without actually applying for them, these sorts of things. So that's gone through. Now, where we haven't, the bill's been put before Parliament, the ministry has assured immigration lawyers and advisors that it was not intended to be used to disadvantage any migrant. But that is not clearly stated in the Act at any point. So we're hoping that through the committee stage and things that will be made clear and put in the Act, because what we're worried about is that once the powers are in place, it's very easy and tempting for the immigration authorities to use that to move people on out of the country, especially if we have severe economic fallout from the effects of COVID-19 and migrants lose their jobs. So there's going to be a little bit of toing and froing over the next few days, hopefully, to make sure that the Act is actually equitable and fit for purpose.
And so presumably that would have a going forward date. So would it be advisable for anyone at this point in time, if you think you're going to have clients that fall in a particular class, maybe to ensure their applications are filed as soon as possible, or do you think it would take effect retroactively from a certain date?
Well, the problem with the current situation is that because the immigration officers haven't been going into the office, any paper-based applications, of which we still have a lot, most notably variation of conditions applications, have to be made in paper, and they're just languishing in the post rooms. So in some respects, it will depend on individual circumstances, but in some respects, it might be better to wait for this bill to come through and for the whole class to be given variation conditions. But it will depend very much on circumstances. For example, Queenstown, which is one of our major tourism destinations, there's a lot of migrant workers there. They have been made redundant because there's no work for them. And if they need to go and work somewhere else, if they get a job in Auckland, for example, our major city, they would need to get a variation or a new work visa arranged, not just variation, a new work visa. And I would foresee that as the labour market becomes tighter, there's more New Zealanders looking for work, an application is less likely to be approved. So in a situation such as that, I would advise the employer and the migrant to get the visa application in now.
Very good. Again, this is new to everyone, so I think it's really important that if anyone has questions, they continuously check back with you for the latest updates, and as it gets passed, maybe in the next couple of weeks or earlier, again, they're referring back to you to make sure that the black layer that actually does get passed is still what we're talking about.
Yeah, and the plan with the Act is it's hopefully to come into force on the 15th of May. That's when it's proposed that royal assent will be given. And the Act stipulates that all changes, all announcements, special directions must be published on the Immigration New Zealand website and also in the Law Gazette. So they've already put in some measures in place to make it at least as transparent as it possibly can be, given the nature of the powers.
Right. Well, that's good. So now let's move into talking about New Zealand's borders, and anyone that potentially does want to travel into New Zealand. We touched on it a little bit with the bubble communities, but if anyone is outside of New Zealand and wants to come back, or somebody's looking to come in, start their employment in New Zealand, can they do that, or how's New Zealand handling borders?
Okay, so the starting point with New Zealand borders is that they're closed.
Okay.
If you are a New Zealand citizen or a New Zealand resident, you can travel and they will let you in, but you will go into compulsory quarantine for 2 weeks upon arrival. If you have a temporary work visa and you've popped home, let's say to Portugal for a holiday, for example, you can only return if you are an essential health worker, and then your family can travel with you. And the list of health workers is very clear. It's the radiologists, the nurses, the aged care workers, etc. Or you are an essential worker. Now, that has not been defined in the immigration instructions. So what you have to do in that point is that your employer has to contact the government department called the lead agency, which is responsible for your area of business, and get special permission for you to travel and for your family. And then you apply online to the immigration department for special permission to travel. So, for example, I'm working on 3 of them at the moment. The health worker, straight in. But I've got an essential construction worker who specialises in security doors and installs them for police stations, hospitals, supermarkets and petrol stations. So all essential service providers, and I've been waiting several days for the government department to consider whether to allow that person to return. So it's pretty difficult if you're outside New Zealand to get back in right now. There is an exception for humanitarian circumstances. For example, if you are very elderly and your entire family were in New Zealand and you were on your own somewhere, I suspect that they may allow you to return.
Okay.
Or a parent was very ill. We've had that, where people have been allowed to return for that, but they've then not been allowed out of quarantine to see their parents in hospital, and unfortunately several of them have died. So it's pretty difficult to get into New Zealand right now, and that's if you can get a flight, because most of them can't even get. We've got this lovely chap in India who we did get special permission for. He's a lovely guy, and he just can't get on a plane. It's, so hopefully the airlines will come to the party.
And are those, if you do get a special permission to enter, is it valid for a certain period of time? Do you have to get into New Zealand?
Yeah, 2 months. You've got 2 months.
So there is some flexibility in the speed at which this is progressing on a weekly basis. 2 months, New Zealand may look very different as might the rest of the world. So yeah, hopefully airlines do pick up and you can come back in. So now let's move on to individuals that are currently in New Zealand. If you have a temporary work permit in New Zealand, do you get automatic extensions, or should you be filing extensions? And if so, how far in advance can you file them?
Okay, if your visa is going to expire from the 1st of April to the 9th of July, I think it is, you will automatically get a work visa extension through till the 25th of September.
Okay.
Okay, so that's been made law under the epidemic notice, not the Immigration Act, which is why this amendment's having to be passed that we're talking about earlier.
Okay.
If you're on any other sort of visa, like an interim or a bridging visa, the same happens. It will go through to the 25th of September. If you're here in New Zealand on holiday, hopefully you're still having a good holiday, it will be extended out as well. Where we've had some tricky things is that people we obviously went into lockdown on the 23rd of March, and so people couldn't travel between then and the 2nd of April, and they weren't automatically extended. So you had to put in an online application because no one was opening the applications at the immigration office.
Right.
So we arranged some extensions that way. My other concern is that a lot of people are going to rely on the automatic extensions. And remember, we're going to have a change to the labour market, and most work visa holders, to get a new work visa, have to demonstrate that the employer has made a genuine attempt to try to find a New Zealander for the job, and that no New Zealanders are available to do the job or readily trainable to do the job.
Okay.
So that's going to get more and more difficult to meet that criteria as the weeks and months go by. Our government's saying that they think we're going to get to around 10% unemployment. I think most New Zealanders think the figure will be much higher than that.
Okay.
Some people are saying up to a third, 30% of the country. So if I had a work visa that was going to expire, I wouldn't rely on that extension. I'd be putting in a new application now under the current requirements. So when Immigration New Zealand is up and running, hopefully we'll process that, and you will be safe until the next time you have to renew your visa.
That's really good guidance. Typically, how long work permits in New Zealand valid for?
It depends on what skill level your job is classified at. So if you're on a low skilled, and I really hate this because what jobs are classified as low skilled really in my mind aren't low skilled. For example, an aged caregiver is classified as low skilled, and they get 3 12-month work visas.
Right.
And if you're mid-skilled, so that would be your plumber, your builder, your chef, and even your lawyer, if you're earning less than $38 per hour, you'll get a 3-year work visa. And if you're earning up more than $38 per hour, you'll get a 5-year work visa.
Okay, so it does vary. That was really important. In terms of other changes, if you are currently working in New Zealand and there's been a change to your employment conditions, so maybe you've reduced your hours or your salary's been reduced, are you required to file any type of amendment with the New Zealand government?
No, you don't have to file an amendment, but you are under an obligation to inform them that your circumstances have changed.
Okay.
So, and it's not actually really very clear about how a migrant would do that. There is a helpline that they can telephone. But of course, if your wage or your hourly rate drops below a certain level, that will affect your skill level and also whether you're compliant with your work visa. And you can be deemed liable for deportation if your work visa no longer matches your circumstances effectively. So you could find yourself served with a deportation liability notice and looking at the compliance action. Also, all work visas are granted on the condition that you work at least 30 hours a week.
Okay.
If your employer wants to drop your hours below 30 per week, both you and your employer are trying to breach immigration law. And the employer is obviously trying to do that in order to keep your job, but it's the immigration legislation makes it a breach of the law, which circles back nicely to why I think that they're bringing in this amendment bill to try and allow for hours to be reduced and wage levels to be reduced.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So it is quite strict with amendments or variances to your employment. Now, the part about any type of pandemic or national emergency, obviously, there can be terminations. How are terminations treated? Are individuals who are terminated given a grace period to either change into another work permit category or visitor visa, or do they have to leave immediately upon termination?
Okay, so it's pretty much the same. If your circumstances no longer meet the conditions in which your visa was granted, you can be deemed liable for deportation. At that point, an immigration officer will write to you and say, we believe that you are no longer employed as a chef at the Holy Grail Hotel. So you've got 14 days in which to write to us and tell us why you shouldn't be deported. And in that point, you try and find another job and explain that you're applying for another work visa. And if you are unable to do that, you've got a further 14 days to appeal to the Immigration and Protection Tribunal on humanitarian grounds against liability for deportation. And humanitarian grounds normally in normal circumstances would be that it's unjust or unduly harsh for you to be deported, and it's not contrary to the interest of New Zealand to allow you to stay. So we're normally talking about people who are being turned to terrible circumstances such as Yemen or Syria, or they've got all their entire family or their children are in New Zealand, and it would be very harsh for them to be separated from their families. But I think under the COVID-19 circumstances, the Immigration Protection Tribunal are likely to take a wider view, given that it may be unsafe for people to travel to locations that traditionally would have been very safe.
So, I mean, if somebody is in an unfortunate situation where they are terminated, they've got to move very quickly to find another job.
And they need to seek professional advice, because if they do not lodge an appeal within that time frame, but they then depart voluntarily, they will be deemed to have been deported and they will be unable to return to New Zealand. So it's extremely important that they get advice right away. And they need to factor in the fact that it costs $700 to lodge an appeal. So they need to keep that money aside. Even if they lodge an appeal and they know it's not going to succeed, at least they can't be deported whilst that appeal is being considered, and it gives them some time to get a flight and get home without putting at risk the chances of ever returning to New Zealand.
That's really important guidance. I think hopefully everyone watching this, if they are impacted by it or know someone that will be, that they're passing on that information. Let's move quickly into permanent residency. How's the coronavirus impacted permanent residency applications?
Okay, prior to coronavirus, we had a huge backlog of skilled migrant category residence applications. The skilled migrant category is the main route by which people get residence in New Zealand. It's a points-based scheme. You qualify for points depending on your attributes such as your age, your qualifications, your job, where it is, whether your partner has got a degree, how many years post-qualification work experience you have. So they were already taking well over a year to process. Nothing has been done, no more work has been done on processing these applications in the last 6 weeks, to the point that they've now suspended selections of people who express an interest in applying for residence under that scheme. So at the moment, it's pretty much cut off for new people to apply for residence. Interestingly, under the new Act, the Amendment Act, they're proposing that any such suspensions would only be for 3 months maximum in the future. So I read from that we will be expecting the skilled migrant category to reopen in 3 months' time. Other thing that we need to be aware of is that for most people who apply for residence under the skilled migrant category, it is dependent on your employment. So if you lose your job, your residence application is likely to fail unless you find yourself another job which is also considered to be skilled.
Okay.
So people need to factor that into account when if they're looking at redundancy or making a decision about their future.
Okay, now if you have lodged a application and your position, let's say your temporary work permit is coming to an end, do you get bridge work authorization by virtue of you having filed a permanent residency application, or you just have to stop working when your temporary work permit?
You can apply for another work visa to stay in that job on the basis that you've got a residence application progressing, and you do not have to meet the labour market check requirement.
Okay.
So you'll do the 12-month work visa, but you must actually apply for this. It doesn't happen automatically. And if I had a shiny New Zealand dollar coin for every client that's rung me who thought that they were going to get their work visa automatically extended because they had a residence visa application progressing, I'd be living in a mansion. But so it's really important that people know that they have to apply for a new work visa. They can't just rely on it being automatic.
Right, absolutely. That's, again, key information there. Now, in terms of top tips that you would want to share with HR, mobility and immigration professionals, what would you be recommending any of those professionals are focusing on during this period?
Well, first thing is that if your organisation is going through a restructure or redundancies in New Zealand, it is incredibly important that you get professional legal advice, because if you do not follow the process, New Zealand's employment law properly, you could find yourself getting a penalty from the Labour Inspectorate or being found in breach of the law by the Employment Relations Authority. If that happens, you will be deemed to be a non-compliant employer, and you'll be unable to sponsor any migrants, including renewing existing employees' visas for at least 6 months, potentially 2 years. So we are seeing is that a lot of employers, they've got the scale of the redundancies and the restructures they're having to undertake is so considerable, and cost cutting is the name of the game, that they're doing things, perhaps they're trying to do a good job, but they're missing out some vital steps in the way, and it will only take one employee to cause your organisation to be deemed non-compliant. So that would be my first practical top tip. Secondly, if you've got employees who are abroad and want to come back into the country and they are essential, again, you need to get help in terms of convincing the government that they're an essential worker. It's actually a reasonably involved process. It's not a simple apply online, right, and everything will be approved, which is what a lot of people have thought it would be. Thirdly, the New Zealand government is restructuring its visa processes. This was underway before all of this happened, and my understanding is that they're going to continue with those restructures. For example, they're proposing that employers have a license or an accreditation to be able to sponsor migrants in the future. So do keep abreast of that, because once your business hopefully is back up and running and you're recruiting again, you don't want to find that you're stymied or unable to do so because you don't have the necessary accreditation. So just keep an eye on that situation and make sure you've got all your HR policies and processes all up to date and up to scratch. Particularly health and safety. I'm sure they're going to be focusing on that quite considerably in the future.
Right. So, okay. Thank you so much for sharing the valuable information. I think as the new Act goes into effect or starts to go into effect over the next 10 days or so, everyone really should be checking back with you to make sure the information is accurate. If there's been any changes, you're able to report them out. But thank you for sharing your tips as well. For all the viewers, thank you so much for watching. Please comment if you have questions, please like it, and please share it. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem, my pleasure.
All right.